Thank the organizers for gathering this really incredible group of people together and for giving me the opportunity to join in the fun. I'm really excited to be here. So far this week we've heard about methods to define, measure, and model networks from Ken, from Thomas, from Martina, and then this morning to model epidemics on networks, analytically and otherwise from Matt, Valerie, Peter, Lorenzo. It's a longer list of people. So networks obviously have been very popular this week. Looking at this group, we wouldn't know that there's still folks out there who are skeptical about networks. So what I'd like to do to finish our discussion of networks off this week is I want to focus on what we've learned about consequences and control from network models in the last 10 to 20 years. And what I'll do is really give you the coffee table book version of some of these insights. And this is very much, again, the standard caveats of it's a personally biased sampling, but hopefully we can go into more general discussions later. So while many network modelers would love to take credit for John Snow's famous work of color and call it a network model, and while the graph theory that network epidemiologists rely on is centuries old, and the social network analysis and the stochastic model theory that we rely on is decades old. The truth is that besides, with the exception of the work of a few people in this room, network epidemiology is a field that's really grown in earnest since the 1993 meeting. And this is my obligatory sort of graph of how the field's grown. So starting, I very much explicitly started in 90 and in a very ad hoc way looked at the number of papers with the terms network model and epidemic in it, and as you can see clearly things have grown very nicely in the last 20 years. We're not quite sure what this blip is. I think it's the joining of the physicists, but that merits more investigation. And in those 20 years really have led to many success stories for considering invasion dynamics in the face of contact heterogeneity, and SARS really gave us some very nice textbook examples of this. Ways of success stories with incorporating social structure, especially with STDs, with incorporating dynamics at multiple scales, as well as being able to incorporate contact structure, population structure to design both public and animal health interventions. So specifically what I'd like to do today is spend some time thinking about both what some of the theoretical findings have been linking structure to epidemic dynamics, and then looking a little bit more at some empirical findings on how structure impacts epidemiological consequences and control policies. And of course the key here will be to think about some of these future challenges. So to start off, the idea here is to basically develop intuition about the relationship between structure and disease consequences. So the question is, what part of network structure is important and how does it matter? So Gianpaolo had asked the question the other day, are random graphs useful, right? So there's two parts to that question. One is, are random graphs good models of real networks? I'd say the verdict is still out on that. I personally believe, depending on what your definition of random graph is, I personally believe that they're not quite as bad as models for the real world as we think. But the other part of that question is, are random graphs useful in our study of network epidemiology? And I think the answer to that part is a resounding yes. And part of the reason for that is that in the last 10, 20 years, we've been able to come up with models that help us generate networks, algorithms to generate networks that are random in some way but have some specified structure. So we have the ability to, with the configuration model of Molloy and Reed, we have the ability to generate random graphs with arbitrary degree distributions. We have the ability to generate graphs with tunable levels of clustering and also tunable levels of modularity. So what these types of graphs allow us to do is combine, in the absence of analytic models that incorporate these types of structures, which has proven to not be trivial. In the absence of those analytic models, we can use these types of graphs with simulations to try to understand how, in a very systematic way, understand how each of these structures matter for epidemiological consequences. So just to go through some examples, starting at the very simplest one of average degree, so the average connectivity of a population. Using these types of models, we've been able to say, obviously, This is obviously a very intuitive result, is that as average degree increases, the epidemic consequences, so in particular the size of the epidemic, gets more severe. But where things get interesting with degree is when you start to look at how much degree varies, how much the connectivity varies in your population. And that's been done primarily by looking at the network version of R0, which I'm quite a fan of this formulation because it really decouples the pathogen parameters, and which have just been written as T here, from the parameters that tell you about the host population. So it really decouples those two processes and makes that explicit. So what this formulation tells us is that as the variance in degree, as the heterogeneity and connectivity in your population increases, the epidemic threshold decreases, so your population becomes easier to invade. What the physicists have derived from this is that for populations that are infinite, which is also realistic, and populations that have extremely high heterogeneity, this means that there is no epidemic threshold. No matter how small the transmissibility of your pathogen, that pathogen would be able to invade the population. Of course, real networks aren't infinite. There's no such thing. And so, but what this amounts to is that finite networks just have a very, very small epidemic threshold. So this has been particularly relevant for sexually transmitted diseases where we know there to be a lot of heterogeneity in contact. So we find that very small levels of transmissibility of the pathogen can get you invasion into the population. So, even before much of this work on variance and degree was actually done, Martina, along with Miriam Kretschmar, in 96 and 97, did some beautiful work extending the concept of degree, which is sort of the cumulative number of contacts or partners you would have over a period of time, to a more dynamic version. So how many contacts do I have currently and simultaneously? So this is a great idea because it's not only a beautiful concept that allows us to differentiate between populations that are made up of serial monogamists versus populations in which people have simultaneous partnerships. It's also fairly easy to measure. So for example, it can be sampled from egocentric networks. So going back to the measurement aspect, it's a fairly easy one to measure. And what Martina and Miriam found was that if you have concurrency in your population, the epidemics grow faster and spread farther. So what that amounts to is, for example, if half the contacts in your population are concurrent, then over a period of about 5 years, you might have 10 times as many infected people in the population. 10 times. That's some severe consequences. Another one, transitivity. So of course, Matt spoke quite a bit about this. So again, transitivity being another word for clusterings or the presence of triangles in your population. So again, using these random graphs that I mentioned earlier with the specified level of or specified number of triangles, we can systematically look at how, as you increase transitivity, what the impacts are. And so we've learned that transitivity increases the epidemic threshold, so makes it harder for pathogens to invade. As transitivity increases, the epidemic size decreases quite a bit. And then as transitivity increases, the epidemic length becomes longer, or epidemics become slower. One interesting thing to note about this is that while transitivity clearly has an impact for low levels of transitivity and low levels of transmission rate, the impact isn't as huge, as significant as we would have believed it was. So Matt, of course, has done lovely work also thinking about spatial clustering, which is a slightly different concept than transitivity or clustering, network clustering, but very, very related. And he found that as contact rate, for lower contact rates, the effect of spatial clustering is actually significantly stronger. So then the question becomes, as is the question with all of these network features, what part of, so where does clustering matter? What's a realistic scale for clustering? So one thing we can do is actually look at the space of all the various empirical networks that we have, and this is just a sample of them. You can look at human networks, livestock networks, wildlife networks, relevant for sexual diseases, relevant for respiratory transmitted diseases. And we can look at average degree versus transitivity. And what, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but what we find is that there is, in fact, quite a distribution, even though most networks tend to be clustered at the lower end of transitivity. There are certainly networks that have more transitivity, so certainly more work required there. I don't think Brian would approve if I gave a network talk and did not talk about rewiring, so this is my rewiring slide just for you, Brian. So Volz and Myers in 2009 have done some nice work looking at a model where you have the ability to incorporate mixing, where the mixing rate actually tells you how frequently contacts rewire. So you have the ability to go from a mixing rate of 0, which describes a static network, all the way to, and as this mixing rate goes to infinity, you're looking at a mass action model. And what they found is that as mixing rate increases, intuitively, the final epidemic size increases. But what was interesting is that this effect is greatest for homogeneous networks. So these 3 lines are a completely homogeneous network, a partially homogeneous network, and more of a heterogeneous network. So the consequences are worse for homogeneous networks. And additionally, they found that in the parameter space of transmission rate and recovery rate, there's quite a large area of that parameter space where this mixing rate matters. So again, going back to measurements, this is another place where we really need more measurements. And so clearly reality lays somewhere in between. For modeling purposes, we're often either at this end or at the mass action end, but clearly reality lies somewhere in between. So being able to infer what that mixing rate is from empirical data is certainly a challenge we need to move in the direction of. So we've heard quite a bit about SIS dynamics over the course of this week. While incorporating SIS dynamics in analytic models has certainly been non-trivial, one thing we can do is incorporate the immune landscape that an epidemic leaves behind. So starting with a population where everyone is completely naive, if you have an epidemic go through and the individuals that get infected, assuming complete immunity for simplicity purposes, those individuals that have gained immunity are no longer part of the epidemiologically relevant part of the network. So it's only these remaining links that make up the new contact network for future epidemics. So what we can actually do is analytically write down what the degree distribution, for example, of this new network is. So if we start with a population, again, that's fully naive, that has some degree distribution, we can write down what the degree distribution of this new population is once these epidemiologically inactive nodes and edges have been removed. And we find that that new network actually is sparser, which is certainly very expected, but more interestingly, it's a much more homogeneous network because you've gone through and removed a lot of the variability in contacts and removed a lot of the high contact nodes in your network. And so this, of course, ends up having consequences for future epidemics, for recurrent epidemics, and also for public health interventions, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So, then just going to some future challenges. So, obviously there's a lot more structural features we need to understand the consequences of, but moving forward, we really need to start thinking about the combined effects of what happens when you have clustering and modularity, or what happens if you have clustering and associativity in your network, what happens if you have clustering and rewiring in your network. And then the other part is being able to figure out which structural features matter. So we can, of course, look at how far apart 2 networks are in topological space by just looking at their network structure. We can look at how far apart they are with respect to social dynamics, but of course, for our purposes, it's most important for us to figure out how far they are in epidemiological dynamic space, right? So, for example, there was work done just recently by Ames et al., which looks at different models that incorporate different parts of the network structure, so clustering coefficient, path length, mean degree, or the degree distribution, and they've looked at how much of the variability in epidemic outcomes is explained by these different network features. And so really we need studies more of this type to try to really figure out what matters in epidemic dynamic space. So now going to to thinking about how network structure has been really exploited for epidemiological interventions. And there's really 2 ways we can do this. We can either look at the intuition that's provided to us from the theory of networks, and you know, what that theory tells us about what we should implement as an intervention theoretically. Or we can actually infer real networks or collect data on real networks and analyze those networks to look at what might be a good intervention. Again, this is a biased list of examples that have just stuck with me as I've grown up in the field. So on the theoretical end, Prof et al. In 2005 put together a nice framework for looking at a variety of different interventions. And so they classified interventions on networks into two categories. One is transmission-reducing interventions. So these are interventions that don't do anything to the network structure, but just reduce the t-value on every edge. So you might have had a larger t-value. Once you implement that intervention, you now have a lower t-value. So these are interventions like wearing face masks, wearing gloves, coughing into your sleeve, washing hands, etc. And what happens, since you're not actually changing the network structure, but just reducing the t-value, if you're looking at a graph of transmissibility, contagiousness versus the epidemic outcomes, what that means is with intervention, you just move farther and farther down this curve. And your goal, obviously, is to move below the epidemic threshold. But these kinds of interventions don't do anything to the contact structure. The other kind are contact-reducing interventions. So here, instead of just changing the weights on edges, you're actually changing the underlying contact network, so that if you're implementing patient quarantining, school closures, social distancing, you're actually removing some of the network edges. And so this, in fact, does impact, since it's impacting the network structure, it actually changes the epidemic threshold. So instead of trying to move down and move to below the epidemic threshold, you're just moving the target to a higher place so that you're now at the same place, you have the same t-value, but you have you're now below the epidemic threshold. So the last category, of course, of interventions is vaccination. And vaccination is probably the most commonly analyzed intervention with network models. And there's obviously, you know, a very intuitive result that comes out of looking at vaccination on networks, and that is if you target the most highly connected part of your network, you'll get the most bang for your buck. And the reason is because that leaves the network sparse. It takes away transmission pathways. It increases herd immunity. So theoretically, that's obviously a very intuitive idea, and it works really, really well. But then the question is, how do you implement that? Just because it's an optimal idea theoretically doesn't mean it's possible to implement practically. So there's been a couple of ways we've moved forward on that. One is work by Cohen et al. All the way back in 2003, actually, which suggested that instead of trying to target random individuals and hoping that you hit on these high-degree individuals, instead you should try to find a random individual in your population and get to one of their contacts. And network theory tells us that following that path gets you to nodes that have higher degree. And so this ends up being a nice practical way, perhaps, to get at nodes that have high degree. Still, you know, implementing this practically isn't always trivial, so we need some other ways to do it. And some of the other ways we've been able to do it is to look for demographic proxies that help us identify nodes that are most likely to be connected. So in human populations, we've been able to use age as a proxy, so that we know school-age children, so this is just data from different empirical and semi-empirical systems that have confirmed that school-age children tend to be the most, most connected part of the population in the context of respiratory diseases. Adults come next, infants, toddlers, and elderly are the least. So if we're looking for high-degree individuals in our population, we can just go after the children. We can similarly do this by occupation, but children age ends up being a really good proxy. This has been done in wildlife systems, so identifying correlating social role to connectivity. So this is a study by Arstead et al. Looking at bumblebee populations, and they've identified social roles such as being the queen bee to be correlates for having high connectivity. And lastly, it's also been done in livestock populations, so looking not at individual livestock networks, but farm-level networks and market-level networks, and identifying that markets quite intuitively end up being the most connected part of a population and would make for good targets for intervention. So contact tracing, I'll go through this quickly since we've talked about it quite a bit already. Contact tracing obviously encapsulates a very fundamental part of the network the network transmission process, and all we're doing there is it's trying to identify in real time infected individuals and their exposed contacts. And this can be useful for, again, for targeting intervention, either therapy or isolation-based intervention. And the therapy can either be treatment for the infected individuals, or if it's just exposed contacts who aren't infected yet, then it can be prophylactic treatment. And the reason, in the context of intervention targeting, this works really well is because by targeting control at infected individuals, you're automatically getting to the high-degree nodes, the high-risk nodes in your population. So you don't have to go to a lot of effort to target that strategy. And this is especially useful for when there's a lot of asymptomatic infection in your population. And Ken and Kiss et al., Ken and Matt and Kiss et al. have done some very nice work looking at sort of when this breaks down and what the relationship of the efficiency of contact tracing is with respect to R naught. So quick example of a very intuitive application of a network concept in thinking about intervention and disease in wildlife populations. So this is work by Hamid et al. With Hamish McCullough, looking at Tasmanian devil populations. And one of the things they did in this population is look to see if the population was one connected component. This is something that doesn't end up being as relevant for human diseases, certainly for respiratory diseases, because we certainly make up connected components. But in this case, this is an endangered species, and the fact that this population made up a connected component meant that the entire population, that entire endangered species, was at risk for this disease. High betweenness. So betweenness is a network quantity that looks at looks for bridging nodes, so nodes that bridge two components or two modules or subgroups of a network. And there's been nice work done, again, looking for proxies as to who tends to be bridging groups or bridging nodes in networks. And truck drivers and seasonal migrant workers have been two proxies, so again, based on occupation, that have been found to be good bridging nodes, and again, these people make good targets. One other thing we can do is in certain cases where we actually know the complete contact network, which doesn't happen all that many times, is that the structure can be exploited further. So in particular, for a contact network of livestock, in this case for the United States, we can look at the problem of regionalization. So how do I split my country up into zones so that I can use those zones for movement restrictions or to set up testing zones for a given disease? And there's a nice algorithm in network theory called community structure detection that helps us break up a network, in this case, into different nodes. And the beauty of this is that this is just based on the network structure alone, that there's no a priori information, no expert information that you would need about how to, or attribute data you would need about what these nodes are. And often in this case, you see that things are clustered by geography, but then it also captures some interesting features like so the dairy states of Michigan and Wisconsin are connected to the dairy states out in the West Coast, and West Virginia is connected because of its beef transports to the northern part of the country. So network models have also helped us think about where our intuition can go wrong. So Chan et al. In 2012 have looked at gonorrhea and treating high-risk groups, which they've defined as core group individuals who have high degree and high assortativity, and looked at different antibiotic therapy targets in that population. So if you treat high-risk individuals, treat 1/3 of each group, treat intermediate-risk individuals. And if you are talking about a population with no antibiotic resistance, things are great. Treating the high-risk group gets you great results. But as soon as you end up with antibiotic resistance, things go haywire a little bit, and treating the high-risk group actually leads to prevalence increasing after a certain amount of time. So, again, because theoretically the most high-risk, highly connected groups, the high assortative groups, should be the best targets, doesn't mean they are. So, so we can start to look at things like that. This is an example that Matt touched on, but I'll repeat it just to make this point that network models have also been used to think about the implications of policy in the long run. So this is analysis that was done by Robinson et al. After looking at the particular livestock standstill policy in the UK, which was implemented after 2001. And they found that over time, because farmers and markets basically rewired their connections in a way to get around this standstill policy, the network actually got to be more robust because the size of the giant component grew, and it became more cohesive and more at risk to infection over time. So this is a type of analysis that can either be done a priori before policy gets implemented to figure out what the consequences might be, or afterwards to figure out if the policy is working and should be continued. So leaves me a couple minutes for thinking about future challenges, and so I'll try to run through these quickly. So hopefully the examples I've shown convince you that that network models have had a lot of success stories in the last 10 to 20 years and have been used in human, livestock, and wildlife systems. But I think there's a ton more work to be done. We can take on a lot more. We can answer much bigger questions and ask much harder questions and really try to get network models to their full potential. So towards that, I think it's sort of high time that we expand the suite of network models beyond just directly transmitted diseases and really start to think about other transmission classes. So an example of this is thinking about mosquito-borne diseases. So one very simple way to incorporate mosquito-borne disease contact structure is to think about how individuals are connected to locations, because locations are where vectors tend to be. And so a bipartite structure like this is a simple way to start. But is this the best way to go? How do we incorporate time scales of transmission between human host to vector and back to human host? What do the frequency and duration of contact? How do they make a difference? And so on. I'm going to go ahead and skip this slide to save some time. The next thing I'd like to make a case for is adaptive management, which is basically an iterative process, of course, of policy decision making. And I think network models can really play an important role in this. And a small example of this is the model that I was describing earlier, where we can incorporate the immune landscape after an epidemic has gone through a population, and that network looks very, very different. And so what happens as a result of that network structure changing is that the risk of infection to different parts of the population has significantly shifted as well. So an adaptive management approach would actually be able to take this into account and come up with a more dynamic and adaptive public health policy that takes that shift into account. Now, implementing that policy in a practical way is probably close to impossible in the current setup, but let's take this one step at a time. And then almost lastly, I want to also make a case for us starting to think about more evolutionary consequences of policy in the context of network structure. So lots of wonderful people, Troy Day, Sylvan Gandon, Angela McLean, have done sort of beautiful work thinking about the evolutionary impact of, for example, imperfect vaccines and other interventions. But I think networks and that network perspective can offer a lot to that discussion. And so our preliminary work thinking about how network structure puts evolutionary pressures on pathogens has already told us, in the absence of intervention, has already told us that different network structures can really put different pressures on, both for immune escape variants and for more pathogenic variants to evolve. So incorporating the filtering that a network goes through once you implement an intervention would certainly be important. Some final ones, which I'll go through even more quickly. So having more of a framework to quantify and incorporate uncertainty in network and disease parameters. This is, of course, something we need to do in general in mathematical epidemiology, but with networks, there's the additional network parameters that have uncertainty. So shedding light on the relationship between network classes and disease classes. So we already have some intuition about sexually transmitted diseases tend to have more heterogeneous networks, and respiratory diseases, like childhood diseases like measles, tend to have more homogeneous networks. So basically making that relationship more rigorous. Incorporating multiple infection processes, so in particular the spread of biological contagion as well as social contagion, so spread of risky behaviors, for example, simultaneously. And then finally, behavioral responses to public health policies. So both Ken and Matt have talked about behavioral change in light of infection, but over here I'm really talking about in response to public health policies. So the FMD standstill policy is an example. The anecdote of mothers taking their children somewhere to some other playground to play together when there's school closures is another example. And then, so finally, a more pie-in-the-sky idea of incorporating epidemiology with behavior, economics, and operations to sort of have one single framework that policymakers can use. So that's my standard acknowledgement slides, but in particular I'd like to thank the RAPID program for the funding to bring me here, and again the organizers. So if I can have Matt and Ken come back up here, we can take questions. So.
First very specific one for Shweta and then Prof.
Maybe since I was worried about random graphs or random networks the other day.
Can you speak up a bit?
Yes, I'll try to make my question more precise. Most results for random graphs or something like that are based on some kind of average of a graph space. Now, how many of the graphs are in some sense decent and generic? For instance, you have had 3 regular graphs as illustrations several times on your slides. And it's nice and connected and has various features.
Right.
How many of all the 3 regular graphs are connected or have nice features? Because the averaging maybe is made of many uninteresting graphs from the point of view of populations.
Right.
So how do we know things like that?
Right, so if it's an analytic model that you're using that assumes that kind of graph structure underneath, then you've got that covered, right? Because that, you're looking at the entire space. The trick comes in when you're actually using an algorithm to generate these types of graphs and then use simulation model to look at the epidemic dynamics. And then it depends on how good the algorithm is. So most of the algorithms out there try to at least sample the space of all graphs of that structure uniformly. And that's what really makes for a good algorithm and a good generative model in that case. But if your generative model isn't good, then it's not doing a good job sampling, and then you're not necessarily getting all those. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, it's perhaps for Ken in the first instance. Can I pick up, Ken, on the general point that you mentioned about what you measure is not necessarily what's actually relevant to transmission. You said there would be some sort of correlation, and that makes sense, but when you showed us the data, the correlations weren't actually very good in the examples that I remember. So where does that leave you? If you make some suppositions about what it is you measure all of that and you do lots of work, but it's not actually very well correlated with the spread of infection on your network, where does that leave you?
Yeah, so that's a central point that I was trying to get at, and as I think I said, you're restricted to measuring. Well, you measure things that seem like they're reasonable and that people can reasonably answer. And it was the quote we had from yesterday that what you want is not what you need, and what you need is not what you have, and et cetera, et cetera. The difficulty is, so what I think you want to be doing is, in an ideal world, measuring absolutely everything and working out which bit of that turns out to be important, but you can't do that. The lovely Fluscape stuff that I touched on is, I think, a massive step in the right direction, but you're measuring contacts over, with a contact diary type approach, you measure contacts in one day, and you look at infection risk over the course of 6 months. Well, people's contacts vary a lot over one day, if you measured it day to day. So you're probably, it's not a very good way at picking out the people at highest risk. So I think you probably have to do repeated measurements. You probably have to do things on a finer time scale. And I think what it would be nice to do is to link infection over a week, middle of a flu season or something, to contacts over a shorter time period and try to get things back together. And it's sort of where I hope some of the genetic work might give us some clues to actually work out who infected whom, and to work and to then go back and do something more along the lines of the contact tracing work to get better information about what the interaction was between these two people. But I think we're a long way away from getting to the right place.
So my question relates a bit to Gianpaolo's. I don't know who it is to. Usually you don't know the whole network. Maybe you have some egocentric data. Maybe you have the degree distribution. Maybe you have degree correlation. Maybe you have clustering or whatever. But you usually don't know the whole network. So the question is, a statement is, there are a lot of networks satisfying these things you have. So which one should we look at? Should we look at the best one or the worst case scenario, or pick a uniform network among those satisfying these things that we know?
I think the ideal answer is you should look at all of them. You should try and search through network space and find networks that have the right degree correlation and clustering and something else. I actually think once you start putting all the details of clustering in, you've actually narrowed down your network space quite considerably. It's something we're trying to look at and are struggling with and haven't got that far. There are algorithms, and Thomas knows more about this than I ever will. There are algorithms that actually allow you to sample through network space quite efficiently. But as soon as you start talking about very large networks, everything starts to break down. So, I think we're getting there. And I think there are solutions to this. But I do think you need to look at all networks rather than just pick on any sort of particular types. But if you don't know things like clustering, you actually have a huge degree of freedom. So I think it's quite it depends on how much information you know as to what sort of networks you can look at.
Space. Some of the literature which seems to suggest that network modelling started in the 1990s, of course, omits the fact that there were models which were essentially networks but were called something different. And the earliest network modelling in epidemics, arguably, was on lattice models back 20 or 30 years before that, which is, and we've had these huge advances since, all sorts of refinements and good ways of looking and so on. But we have a bit lost space, and how do we get, so what I would say a challenge is how do we get space back into network modelling?
Okay, I'll give a quick answer, which is a lot of these social contact diaries ask about location. So it asks about home location, and they very often ask about distance. Some of them are even geo-referenced as to where you had the contact. So I think people are slowly putting space back in, but it's space that most of the people I meet will be people who live nearby me, which gives you a localized network rather than something actually explicitly spatial.
But what I'm worried is that the modelling is essentially on a large-scale mean field. If you define a model in terms of local clustering, then and don't actually explicitly put in space, then you are essentially at a large scale doing mean field modelling. And for some things that may not matter, but for others I think it does.
I agree completely. I think it is the next thing. It's this higher order structure that comes in. Hopefully, maybe because of the long range links that human contacts generally have, it's not going to be that important. We know how fast infections can spread sort of globally, but it is the next thing. It's one of the things we're trying to think about, and we're banging our head against the wall trying to work out nice ways of doing it.
Brian, is this very directly connected to that, or can we take Martina first?
Martina first.
Okay, Martina.
Okay, a couple of just random comments and then a question. And so the random comments are, like Dennis, I remember some earlier work that's probably relevant here. And in particular, Klaus Dietz had a very nice dynamic model for monogamous partnerships. And so the whole idea of partnerships, I think, is one of the things that motivates the need for network models, which then leads to sort of another general observation that, picking up on, again, Brian's wonderful concept of case law. It's often the case when I hear people talk about network models as though we're somehow thinking that there's a network out there. But the network that matters for your particular case really depends on the pathogen you're talking about. And we don't expect somehow that our measurement process and our thinking about epidemics, when we think about the biological parameters, is going to be divorced from what tau is, that transmissibility parameter. But the same thing is true about networks. I mean, the network structure that matters really depends on the case. And so I think we need to become more, intelligent, I think, about understanding that what we need to represent in networks depends on exactly what diseases we're modeling, and so not try to do them all at once. And part of what that's going to be, and this really gets at the question of space, I think, is ultimately these models are going to have to be hierarchical. And some levels of detail matter for some kinds of models, and they don't matter for other kinds of models. And I suspect that there are going to be eventually a lot of cases in which we say, actually, a mass action model is just fine. So network models are not going to be the model that you need for every disease. So what we really need to understand is what diseases do we need network models for and why. Why will tell us what we need to measure properly about these things. And I have a suspicion that a lot of those things are going to be about partnerships and the construction of partnerships.
We go straight to Brian.
So, I'm glad you went first now, because that was expressing it much better than I could. Thanks to Shweta for the rewiring slide. That was great, and that is great work that you reported. I'm tempted to ask, there's a famous paper in the first one by Chris and Brian, does having a vector make a difference? Has anybody written a review about does having a network make a difference? Because sometimes, as we noted, sometimes emphatically yes, sometimes don't need it so much. Matt's wonderful agent-based FMD model had a dispersal kernel and it was fine in my remembrance, for example.
I forgot to ask the question. Can I ask the question? I saw you voice the question. I was like, oh yeah, damn. So here's the question. Where do you think this kind of exponential random graph modeling framework fits into the kind of work that you're doing?
So to address Brian's question first, certainly I don't think that review's been written. I'm not quite sure we're there yet. I think we're still grappling with some of the fundamentals of what matters, and then we can really try to describe what matters in the context of epidemiology. My personal view on the ergoms is that they can play a really important role in helping us answer these questions of what matters, right? Both from the perspective of network structures, so if you incorporate these various network metrics into your ergoms, and out you get an answer of which ones matter. But in addition, based on covariates and attributes, helping us understand what actually drives contact dynamics and how that varies from, within humans, from sexually transmitted diseases to respiratory transmitted diseases, because certainly not the same things are going to matter. And then extending that to other populations. So, livestock contact movement dynamics, are they driven by economics? Are they driven by, transportation networks underlying these movements? What are they driven by? So, and being able to understand at a mechanistic level what's driving these contact dynamics is a really important role I think ergoms can play.
In an attempt to answer both of those points, I think the reason why I thought networkiness was important is because it gives you some way of getting at the correlation between people who interact, and the fact that locally you can run out of susceptibles even though globally you might not notice anything. And that's so obviously relevant with the partnership models and sexually transmitted infections that there really should be a strong correlation in infection status between people who have long-term sexual contacts, but that may not be true for kind of respiratory infections. So then I think probably the answer to whether the network matters depends on the difference between your number of contacts and your expected number of secondary cases. So if you meet 50 people for an infection with an R0 of 1.5, well, maybe the network doesn't matter much. But if the people that you infect are always the people who you share a house with, then the network does.
I just have one final answer to Brian's. I think also the question of whether or not a network matters depends what your alternative model is. And if your alternative model is something with lots and lots of structure, you can probably get away without a lot of the network influence. But if you're just comparing it back to sort of a standard SIR model, I think there's going to be more differences. I think it to some degree it depends what you're comparing to.
Okay, a final word from Conor, and then it's lunch.
I think Mark Woolhouse provided the answer right. The Scots didn't get a first wave pandemic flu because it didn't hit a school. I can't think of any paradigm apart from the network one that explains that.
I think this could go on and on.
I
don't mind. I mean, I'm happy to keep going if you want the discussion to go on longer, but if people are getting itchy. Would you like to continue? I mean, lunch at Wilson Court's at 5:30, I believe. So, are you happy to go on till then? Okay, so Dennis and then...
I just have a brief, I think, when you say, should you have networks as your model or whatever, it reminds me of the character in Molière, who just, the ignorant character who discovers on becoming educated that he's been speaking prose all his life. You know, I think networks is a bit like that. Those of us who have been studying academics realise we've been studying networks all our lives. So there's a linguistic thing here. We must be a little bit careful not to just get entangled in that.
I think another word from Tom. No? Peter.
Yeah, I want to make one remark, and it's related to what Dennis said. If space plays a role, then networks are important. That's clear, and we shouldn't try to mimic something like what we do for random mixing populations or for configuration model networks. I really want, there you definitely will see the network reappearing in your academic spread, and it won't be exponential spread, and everything which predicts exponential spread you should not use. That's my, I think, as I said before in my part, pair approximations might be very useful on configuration models, but just don't use them on spatial epidemics because it does strange things.
Any last comment?
I did promise I was going to let you have a chance to fill in a network survey, so here it is. If you're willing, I'd like to ask people something about the social and professional networks that exist in this room. So I've coupled together a little survey which will have a load of people's names misspelled and all that kind of thing, because it was very early this morning. But if you fancy filling it in, then we'll collect the data back and do something with it over the next week or so. That might be fun. So I'll put them on the door, and do take one. Thanks.